You're good. Everyone else is muted. When we see you, so in a minute, you're gonna have to say, share screen again. Or do you see your screen on your screen?
I can see my screen on the screen.
Okay. Okay, recording has begun now. We can start.
Are we ready to begin? Lena?
Yes, I have the recording on. Go ahead.
Okay, we're going to begin now. Is everyone in?
Yes,
Okay, thank you for setting this up.
you're welcome.
I'm going to introduce Dr. Richard Zartman. I have something that I hope you'll remember to do, and that is after your presentation, would you tell us what you do out here at the landmark, your research a little
Okay.
bit? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Zartman right now.
Hello, my name is Richard Zartman. I got my undergraduate degree in soils in 1968 from The Ohio State University. Got my PhD in soil physics from the University of Kentucky in 1974. Soil physics is how heat, water, and air moves through the soil. And from 1974 to 2014, I was a faculty member at Texas Tech University in the Plant and Soil Science Department. And the last 3 years, I was chairperson of that department. Once I retired, I became sort of a professional grandfather for about a year. And then I started coming out here at Lubbock Lake Landmark and have been a docent out here since 2015. The course learning outcomes for this particular module are explain water resources of Texas, and the module learning outcome. By the end of this lesson, the volunteers should be able to identify the functions of water within the environment, identify the functions of soil with respect to water, understand the water hydrologic cycle, the water balance equation, and identify water resources of Texas. Understanding the importance of water conservation, protection of both surface and groundwater sources, understand the management of water resources in Texas, including water rights and ownership, be familiar with the state water planning and groundwater management, understanding water availability models, drought contingency plans, water conservation plans, become familiar with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Land and Water Strategic Plan, understand how water quality is assessed, managed, and how the planning process is being used to improve water quality. Be familiar with the state and federal agencies and water resource institutes that work with public issues concerning water policy. Become familiar with the emergent water policy and issues and understand the actions that you could take. I'm sure that you've had information about climate change and global warming. From my perspective, the lack of water, lack of good quality water is significantly more important than climate change. It will be a much more critical, and the problems will come sooner. We're having those problems as we speak right now. I hope everyone who has talked to you in this course has told you their particular segment is the most important. I believe that when we talk about soil water is the most important thing. You've probably heard in life the concept to find your passion, go after it. My passion has been how water moves in the soil. In my career at Texas Tech, most of my research was dedicated to understanding how water moves in the soil. This first cartoon shows how important is water. What liquid resource is more important than our survival than this? And there's a can of oil. Other guy has a bottle of water. When I teach this course or other courses face to face, I look around the audience and see if anybody has a one-time use bottle of water. I hope none of you have a one-time use bottle of water for many reasons. One of them is the water in that bottle costs more than gasoline. The second thing is that It's very hard to get rid of that bottle. It doesn't break down to CO2. Plastic in the environment is a tremendous problem. And so we get by with lack of oil much more easily than we get by without water. Try going a day without drinking water or anything from it. How does water function within the environment? Water influences the physical, biological, and chemical properties. When I talk about heat flow, when I talk about physical properties, I mean heat flow within the soil, shrink swell potential. When the soil gets wet, it expands. When it gets dry, it shrinks. Biological properties of plant growth, organic matter decomposition, chemical properties of chemical reaction and redox potential. You and I have many chemical reactions going on within our body right now, and they're water reactions. We talk about plants. Plants have water reactions taking place. One thing I need to tell you that I'm probably not the most dynamic of speakers, and so if you have a question, stop me and ask a question. The idea of this is for you to learn what's happening with Texas water resources. What's the function of soil with respect to water? The soil has three particular functions with respect to water. One of it is acquire, move water into the soil. A second function is store, retain water for plant use or evaporation. And three, deliver water to plant roots, upward or downward flow within the soil. Your textbook has the water cycle as follows. This is a nice water cycle in that it talks about precipitation, and then we have evaporation or evapotranspiration. And then that water is in the atmosphere as a gas. That water needs to condense into a liquid water to fall to the soil by precipitation. A week or so ago in Lubbock, we had snow, sleet, hail. Those were different types of precipitation that we have. Again, the nice thing about this water cycle is you can see the circular nature of it. Condensation, precipitation, evaporation. The water goes around that cycle. From a practical standpoint, you need to be aware that the public has a different perception of the water cycle. Sometimes it's called the hydrological cycle. If we don't have any rain, there's panic. If you remember back in the Lubbock area about 2 months ago, we were in a fairly severe drought and they were panicking. The weather people on TV were pulling out their hairs, ranting, we don't have any water. And then we got some of that snow, hail, we got a little bit of precipitation, and so apathy again. But when we run out of the water that we have for this last cycle, then we'll go back into drought. Then once we get drought, we need to have an awareness and concern before we get to the panic stage. People's perception of water is really qualitative. We have too much water. If you were in the southern part of Louisiana right now and you had 2 hurricanes go through recently and you're flooded and another hurricane is coming, you think we got way too much water. Sometimes we get the right mix of water and lack of water. We are in a good state. But then sometimes we don't have enough water through precipitation. And so we have too little, too much, or just right. When we are flooded or when we're in a drought, there's a panic. When there's appropriate rainfall, as the above diagram illustrates, there's apathy. To quantify water additions and losses from the soil in the above cycle, we use a water balance equation as follows. The water balance equation has sources to add water and sources to lose water. P is for precipitation, I is for irrigation, R on is run on, R off is runoff, E is evaporation, T is transpiration, D is deep drainage, and delta S is the change of stored water. If we talk about additions of water, precipitation is the natural source of water for plant growth. In combination with surface runoff, precipitation provides water to streams, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, bays, and estuaries. Irrigation is supplemental addition of water for plant growth, and it comes from surface waters or subsurface aquifers, and is not part of a natural cycle. Run-on is a local topography or lay of the land, and if land is low, water moves onto it from an upslope area. Those are additions of water for any particular area. We talk about losses. We have evaporation, which is water loss from the bare soil surface to the atmosphere, or from paved parking lots and things like that to the atmosphere. Changes from a liquid to a gas. Transpiration is water loss from the stomates of the plant in the atmosphere. And again, it goes from a liquid to a gas. Evapotranspiration is the algebraic sum of evaporation and transpiration. Deep drainage, this is water that returns to the surface through rock outcroppings or subsurface water, such as aquifers. Runoff is loss of water from an upslope area. If we talk about either additions or loss, the delta S is the change of stored water. To make the water balance equation actually balanced, we have to have this delta S component. If it rains one day and the plants do not evaporate that water or transpire that water, we don't have evaporation or runoff, then that excess water is stored in the delta S term. If, however, we're not having any water applied and the plants are evaporating, or we're having water loss through plants or evaporation, then that delta S term is a negative component. So that delta S, it makes the water balance equation balance. On a daily basis, the change of stored water can be positive, negative, or zero. But if we talk about the long-term basis, delta S is zero. If we talk about the amount of stored water we have this year, it's about the same as it was last year and the year before. Precipitation, evaporation, transpiration sort of balance on a year-to-year basis. To make the balance actually make the equation balance, as I mentioned, we talk about the delta S term. What's the weak link in that particular equation? The weak link is deep drainage. It's hard to measure how much water moves below the root zone and how to quantify that. We have a good way to talk about measure irrigation or precipitation. We have good equations to measure evaporation or transpiration, but deep drainage is the one component that's really very hard to measure. Another water balance equation picture can be shown in the following slide. And I really like this. This is one I used for many, many years when I was a faculty member at Tech. We have rain or snow that adds water to the system. Water is lost back to the atmosphere by transpiration. Water moves by runoff into rivers, streams, lakes, or the ocean. And it can move by deep drainage into the aquifer. When we discuss additions of water, we typically think of precipitation. Typical precipitation in Lubbock is about 18 inches per year, and precipitation varies as a function of location within the state. In Texas, the average annual precipitation ranges from 8 to 56 inches, as shown below. If you look at the state of Texas, you'll see bands that almost run vertically that have different rainfall. 56 inches in the very southeast US. And then as we march westward through the state, we have less and less areas of precipitation. So at the Gulf Coast and southeast Texas, we have high rainfalls. If we look at far west Texas, the El Paso area, we have very limited amount of rainfall, about 8 inches. So there's a great rainfall gradient, great precipitation gradient in the state of Texas. Well, precipitation is a natural component that drives Texas water availability. It is offset by water loss through evapotranspiration, as shown by the components ET in the above equation. And the value for Texas potential evapotranspiration, ET0, are shown below. Now, we also have sort of vertical bands going through the state with fairly low evapotranspiration in the east. And then as we march further west, the evapotranspiration rate increases. And so the Texas and the western Texas and El Paso region along the Rio Grande has very high evapotranspiration rates. If you look at the area in East Texas, we have about an evapotranspiration rate of about 56 inches. That matches fairly well the rainfall. Rainfall and precipitation match. But as we go further west, in the previous picture, the water through precipitation decreased, but the evapotranspiration increases. Now, please note this is potential evapotranspiration. In other words, if I set a coffee cup out and measured how much water transpired from that coffee cup in a year basis, it would greatly exceed the rainfall. The evapotranspiration rate in West Texas is probably about 80 inches. We only get 10 inches or 8 to 10 inches of rainfall. So the further west we go, the more critical the water problem becomes. Note that the greatest potential evapotranspiration rate occurs where the least amount of rainfall. Precipitation can be augmented by irrigation. Irrigation, as I previously mentioned, is supplemental additions of water from groundwater or surface water sources. Irrigation consumes the water. There is less liquid water in the system after irrigation than there was before. For example, the city of Lubbock uses twice as much water in the summertime as it does in winter. But much of that water is consumed by irrigation, does not enter the sewer system as return flow. Return flow from water in Lubbock is about the same amount in the summer as it is in the winter, even though we use twice as much water in the summer because it goes for irrigation. If we talk about irrigation in this region or irrigation worldwide, that water is consumed. Liquid water is added as irrigation. It is then lost by evapotranspiration, or it's lost in the crop unit that you harvest, but you never see that water again. So water is consumed when we talk about irrigation. If we talk about the different types of irrigation methods, there are two general categories, either surface irrigation or subsurface irrigation. In surface irrigation, water is applied through the air to the soil surface. There are several different types of surface irrigation. First, I want to talk about is sprinkler irrigation. Sprinkler irrigation, shown below, can be inefficient as water can evaporate in the atmosphere or run off before entering the soil. If you look at the sprinkler on the left, it shoots water up in the air, and a lot of that water evaporates before it ever hits the soil surface. I like to say in the summertime, we have 80-degree temperature, 20-mile-an-hour winds, 20% relative humidity. A lot of that water that came out of that sprinkler head never hits the ground. Another problem with sprinkler irrigation is the picture on the right, which is the picture of the Tech campus. This is a picture between the plant science building and the library and the irrigation system flooding that sidewalk. Many, many summers as I walked from my building to the library at Texas Tech, I had to wade through ponded water on that sidewalk. That was wasted water. It did not infiltrate the soil. It just evaporated. Another way of talking about surface irrigation is basin irrigation. And basins are individually constructed around individual trees or small plots, and they're flooded individually. The above figure is a tree being watered on the Texas Tech campus. Note the ring of soil forming the basin being filled with water. This is a common practice during the establishment phase for transplanted trees or other plants. Much of the applied water is not used by the plant, but lost by evaporation from the water surface or deep drainage below the tree roots. A third method is the drip or trickle systems. Systems that add water from a low pressure conveyance tubes. The drip system typically emits water by the drop, where the trickle system emits water as a stream. The drip at the soil surface, the first figure on the left is a grape vineyard in California being irrigated by drip irrigation. The drip emitters are attached to the trellis, and water goes from the emitter tubes down to the soil surface. The figure on the right shows a drop being emitted from an emitter tube. Trickle irrigation produces a stream of water. The next two slides are from my backyard. It's hard to see, but there is a yellow heavy end on this pot. There are conveyance tubes that go to really small plastic tubes that are called spaghetti tube. Water comes out, and if you don't have them anchored, then the water goes everywhere. So they put the heavy ends on the end of the spaghetti tube to keep the water in place. The figure on the right shows ground emitter, the irrigation line, and the white color on the soil surface is salts. Later on, we talk about pollution, we'll talk about salts, but Lubbock water has a relatively high salt concentration. When used as irrigation, the salts accumulate at the soil surface. We can also have subsurface irrigation. This is a system that adds water below the soil surface. The above figure shows drip irrigation tape being buried into a potato field. Years ago, I did potato research with subsurface drip irrigation. We put the emitter lines down with the seed piece and then bury them back up so we could irrigate the potatoes. This is a highly efficient method of irrigation because we have minimized to a great extent the evaporation. All the water loss will be taken up by the plant through evapotranspiration and then get benefit that way. You can purchase emitter tapes with varying space between the emitters. Excuse me. Let me get a drink of water. Just a second. You can purchase emitter tapes in various spaces. Typically, the ones that I have in my backyard have emitters once every foot. You can buy them with emitters every 6 inches or longer. If you have any questions, just please break in and ask me. Your textbook says that Texas possesses tremendous water resources, both above ground surface water and below ground groundwater. One unique factor in Texas is who owns the water. This question was decided by a Texas Supreme Court case in 1904, Houston and Texas Railroad Company versus East. And I've given you a citation of how to look that up. The thing that I think is interesting in this, typically when we think about water use, we think of for irrigation. This, however, was when they still had steam engines. And so Houston and Texas Central Railroad had a big well to pump water for its steam engines. Now, what happened was, in this particular case, the railroad pumped so much water. I think it was like something like 22,000 gallons per day from that. And the landowner right adjacent to that started running out of water. And so he sued. And it turned out after this court case was tried and then appealed, and finally the Texas Supreme Court ruled that whoever owns the groundwater, whoever owns the land, owns the groundwater underneath it. This case determined that surface water is severed from groundwater. In other words, the state of Texas owns the surface water, but if you own land and have not sold the water rights underneath it, you own that groundwater. The often quoted statement from that case is the following. And I think it's a unique statement, and that's why I'm going to read it. Because of the existence, origin, movement, and course of such water, talking about groundwater, the causes which govern the direct their movements are so secret, occult, and concealed, my italics, that an attempt to administrate any series of legal rules with respect to them would be involved in hopeless uncertainty and would therefore be practically impossible. Very important case. The surface water that we have today is based on, surface water rules are based on that particular case. This ruling means the landowner, unless they've sold their water rights, owns the water into their land. This ruling allowed Texas to become a law of the big straw state. If you own the water rights on the land, you can use it. The groundwater is pumped from one of the Texas aquifers. So if you own the land, you own the water underneath it. We call it the law of the big straw because it doesn't matter how big or small your well is, you can pump that water as long as you can get it. Now, I don't know if any of you have kids, but if you've had kids of a certain age and you take them to McDonald's, one of the things they learn about the time they're in preschool is that if you have a Coke and you suck on the straw, after the Coke is gone, you hear this slurping sound. And a lot of times kids at a certain age enjoy doing that, much to the chagrin of their parents. But this law of the big straw is the same thing. You can pump water as long as there's water there. The law of the big straw with McDonald's is you can drink your Coke as long as there's Coke in there. There are 9 major groundwater aquifers in Texas, and I'm not going to go into the names of them, but I want you to look at the state of Texas. You can look at the various color maps in here are the various major aquifers in Texas. This blue area is the Ogallala Aquifer that we use right now. The Gulf Coast Aquifer is the yellow area. And then we have the Edwards and Trinity and other aquifers there. In this region, we are particularly interested in the groundwater component of the Ogallala Aquifer. I'm assuming that most of you are from the Lubbock area and would be most interested in the Ogallala Aquifer. And the Ogallala Aquifer is shown below. It covers about 8 states, from Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. These states are over, or parts of these states are over the Ogallala Aquifer and use the water that's in it. This is one of the major aquifers for irrigation use in the nation, and it is the major aquifer for irrigation in Texas. When we talk about the Ogallala Formation, the Ogallala Formation was formed anywhere from 5 to 10 million years ago, and the water that is now in the aquifer is what we call fossil water. It moved in over long periods of time. If we look at the Ogallala Aquifer, I want you to think of it as sort of a shallow bowl. In Texas, where we are, The water is fairly close to the surface, but there's not much water available. If you go south of us to about the Lamesa area, the Ogallala Aquifer runs out and it comes absolutely to the soil surface. As we go further north from Texas, New Mexico to Nebraska, the aquifer gets deeper, but there's more available water. So there are certain areas of Nebraska, especially in the sandhill areas, that the Ogallala aquifer is actually recharging. But here it is not a rechargeable aquifer. And so we're running out of water. But think of this as a shallow bowl that in the Lubbock area, it's not too deep to the Ogallala aquifer, but there's not much water in the Ogallala aquifer. As we go further north, it becomes deeper to the water, but then deeper water. If you notice where the Canadian River goes through, it drains the aquifer. And so we have the southern Ogallala here, and then we get the other parts of the Ogallala north of it. The Ogallala aquifer is a non-rechargeable aquifer. That means the water pumped from it is not rapidly replaced. The Ogallala aquifer is fossil water, meaning that it was accumulated before or during the last ice age from water runoff from the Rocky Mountains. This water is not being replaced at anywhere close to the amount it's being extracted. Water extracted from a non-rechargeable aquifer is consumed. And it's very, very critical to the well-being of the people in this area about how we use the Ogallala aquifer. By contrast, in the San Antonio area, the surface water rapidly runs into the Trinity and subsequently in the Edwards aquifer at the Balcones fault zone is illustrated. Here is Bexar County, which is San Antonio. The Balcones fault is here. And in this region, they have big holes in the soil surface that water runs into when it rains. I don't know if they still do, but I've been in San Antonio at times when they talk about it rained and the aquifer went up 3 feet, or the aquifer went up 1 foot today based on the amount of rainfall. This is a recharging aquifer. There are both good and bad things about having an aquifer that porous. Water in Edwards aquifer can rise in a matter of hours or days due to precipitation, but the rapid rise of the aquifer minimizes the cleansing effect of water by having the soil filtered out contaminants. A lot of the land over the Edwards aquifer is rangeland. And so cattle waste can go directly from the soil surface into the aquifer through these large pools. The water cycle of the Ogallala aquifer is very, very long-term. Edwards aquifer in the San Antonio area is very short-term. Does anybody here know who the guy in the center is? It's Alley-Oop. Alley-Oop was a cartoon character from probably the 40s and 50s. And I like this because I use this in class, that water runs through the aquifer around San Antonio. It's sort of like water moved through this guy's head. It just goes very, very rapidly. Water enters the soil through large surface orifices at Balcones fault and directly enters the aquifer. Several aspects of the Texas aquifer water resources were not addressed by your text. One was land surface subsidence due to pumping of water from the aquifer. In the Houston, Galveston region, removal of water from the Chilcot and Evangeline aquifers has caused the land surface to fall by as much as 7.5 feet. Think of that. The soil surface was 7.5 feet higher at one time than it is now. Why? Water was pumped from the aquifer. The aquifer is a solid liquid air mixture. If you remove the water, that helps hold up the soil surface. The water is removed, air replaces it, and so the whole soil subsides. This is really a big problem in the Central Valley of California also. This subsidence can result in catastrophic flooding in the Houston, Galveston area, and is caused by compaction of fine grained material to surface. If the water is removed, they get this subsidence, and the aquifers that I talked about, the Chilcot and the Evangeline, are part of the Gulf Coast region, Texas aquifer. Now, surface water from springs, creeks, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, estuaries, and bays are owned by the state. If you own the land, you didn't sell it, you own the groundwater underneath it. But once it gets to the surface, the state owns it. The following figure shows Texas lakes, rivers, and water resources. If you look at this, you see the Rio Grande, and then you see the Pecos, and the Colorado, and the Brazos, the Trinity, the Red, and the Canadian rivers. One interesting thing, and sort of almost counterintuitive, is what's the headwaters for these rivers? The headwaters from these rivers are in the drier portion of the state. The headwaters generate water and it goes to the wetter areas. Please understand, it has nothing to do with how much rainfall you have that starts these rivers. It has to do with elevation. Water moves from high potential, low potential. It moves from high elevations to low elevations. And so the elevations in the western part of Texas are higher than they are at the Gulf Coast. And so water moves from high elevation to low elevation. And so these rivers run essentially from northwest to southeast. If you notice these rivers, they also have various tributaries. You got many more tributaries at the rivers as we go farther to the east. Texas has more than 1.2 million acres of lakes and 2.1 million acres of saltwater bays. Yeah, we can use the fresh water for growing crops, watering animals, but the seawater is too salty and cannot be used for those particular purposes. Surface water for Lubbock, Texas comes from Lake Meredith on the left and Lake Allen Henry on the right. So here is Lake Meredith and here is Lake Allen Henry. Both of these surface water resources are human modified by damming rivers. The Canadian River is the water source for Lake Meredith, while the Double Mountain Fork of the Brazos River is the water source for Lake Allen Henry. Of all of the lakes in Texas, there is only one natural lake, and that's Caddo Lake, as shown below, that occurs. And this is on the east coast or the eastern border of Texas with Louisiana. So of all the lakes we have in the whole state of Texas, they are caused by damming rivers or streams, impounding the water to create the surface water. The only one natural lake in the whole state is Caddo Lake. Now, here in West Texas, we have what we call playa lakes. The playa lakes of the southern high plains are ephemeral lakes. Ephemeral lakes means they have water immediately after a rainfall or a precipitation event, But over a period of time, the water is transpired or evaporated, it goes back to the atmosphere, and so it is gone. The surface water is owned by the state of Texas, but if you have a playa lake, that is not considered surface water because it evaporates so rapidly. The state does not own that. Here's a picture of the Southern High Plains with some playas. And again, there are about 1,006 playa lakes in the county of Lubbock. They are ephemeral. They have water only when it rains. Now, if you look at cities from I-20, from Lubbock North to Amarillo on I-27, a lot of those cities have playa lakes that have water in them continuously. Why? In an urban area, we have a lot of impermeable surfaces, rooftops, parking lots, drives, streets, and those waters run into the lakes. And the water that runs into them will keep the lake wet year-round. When Texas water is considered, bays and estuaries are a component of that water. These surface waters are not freshwater bodies, but are significant components to support the state's wildlife. Here are the golf course estuaries as shown in your textbook. And notice they are tied in with the rivers that run into them. Additionally, Texas has many acres of wetlands that are permanently or seasonally flooded. If we look at this picture on the right, this is a JPEG that I picked up from Texas Department of Parks, and it shows cypress trees with water around it. If we look at the picture on the left, this is the Deweyville soil series. This is the only histosol or only organic soil in the whole state of Texas. Why is it organic? Why does it have organic matter rather than sand, silt, and clay dominating it? It is because that it is seasonally flooded and the organic matter cannot decompose very rapidly when it's anaerobic. And so it is an organic soil. Of all the soils in the state of Texas, as far as I know, the Deweyville soil is the only one that is an organic soil that has preponderance of organic material rather than sand, silt, and clay. Now, if we talk about flooded or riparian areas, here's the Canadian River watershed near Boys Town. Here's the White River watershed near Crosbyton. These are the watersheds that pump in water to Lake Meredith when the Canadian River, or White River Lake when we talk about the one on the right. White River Lake has a problem of water availability. It was designed in the 1950s when there was very little vegetation around and runoff was overestimated. White River Lake now oftentimes is very low in water. And I think right now it's about 20% capacity, whereas Lake Meredith is about 30% capacity. We talk about water conservation and protection. Conservation means using less water and or using water more efficiently. In urban settings, much of the surface water irrigation applied runs off as shown below. Again, some pictures I took on the Tech campus, the spray patterns and sprinkler irrigation. Notice the water goes on the pavement receiving the irrigation water when it was intended for the grass and not the pavement. Care must be taken to ensure that water remains on the area in which it's supplied. If you look at these, we have people irrigating their lawn in the wintertime. Water runs off and creates ice. These are pictures I took several years ago when I taught urban soils to talk about this problem. But let me assure you, the problem has not stopped. A week or so ago, when we had the ice and I went for my morning walk, there were people still irrigating, have running water going off the lawn, off their sidewalk into the street. And in all candor, you're liable if somebody slips on that ice from having water being applied in freezing conditions. So it's truly a hazard when you have runoff water in the street and it freezes. It must be understood that not all water resources are the same. Surface water, such as streams, rivers, and lakes, generally receive water from surface runoff. They're replenished with precipitation events or water discharge from springs or urban reuse. Even in areas such as the island of Kauai and Hawaii, there are concerns about water use. Before the pandemic hit this year, my wife and I went to the island of Kauai. The island of Kauai in Hawaii, there's some areas that receive 453 inches a year. Think about that. We get 18 inches. They get 453 inches. A lot of the Hawaiian islands have roads that go all the way around it. Kauai is one of those that is an exception because it is just so wet. They tried to build a road through this area and it failed because they just could not install it with that much water being received. But even though they have that much water, if they divert some of that water for irrigation, then we have saline water returning to the sea. Let's talk about the state water plan. Drought in its simplest terms is a significant lack of water availability to lower than anticipated precipitation. That's the classic definition of drought, lack of water. Now, and typically the things that I've talked about so far today are sort of the science behind this, but there's also a social implication of drought. If we talk about the drought in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era, there are two great books that if you've not read, I would encourage you to read them. One is Grapes of Wrath, and the other is The Worst Hard Times. The Worst Hard Times talks about Lubbock area north. Those are talking about the drought during the 1930s. In 1950s, we had another extreme drought. And at this time, Texas decided that they need to have a plan for water in the future. This drought was in some essence even worse than the drought that they had in the 1930s. People in Texas would take a blowtorch and blow off the needles of prickly pear so that they could feed their cattle the prickly pear to have some source of food for them. If you want to read a book that talks about Texas in the 1950s and drought, read the book, The Time It Never Rained by Elmer Kelton. That's one of those books that you read, it will just tear your heart out and you can stomp on it. It's that significant in depiction of what people went through in the drought of the 1950s. By this time, the law of the big straw was becoming unrealistic. People could not build enough irrigation wells to pump the water to overcome this drought. At this time, they had big wells, 12-inch diameter wells, and they would pull those big wells and put in smaller ones, 8-inch wells or 4-inch wells. Because that example I mentioned of the straw McDonald's, they could not pull water through a 12-inch column. They were sucking air. And so at this time, the water of the big straw, the law of the big straw became totally false because they could not pump enough water. But in 1950s, Texas recognized this need. And in 1957, to address the problem, the Texas legislature created the Texas Water Development Board, TWDB. And the mission of Texas Water Development Board, and let me quote, the mission of the Texas Water Development Board is to lead the state's efforts in ensuring a secure water future for Texas and its citizens. Our mission is vital to Texas' overall vision. The state's mission and goals to relate maintaining the viability of the state's natural resources, health, and economic development. If you're from the Lubbock area, you know the dominant ethic is, hey, it's my water, I can do whatever I want to do. But by 1957, some of the people were starting to realize that, hey, you know, I can't do everything in this. And so the state of Texas, much to the chagrin of a lot of local landowners, had this Texas Water Development Board to start having some rules on how water is being used. The Texas Water Development Board develops water supplies and prepares plans to meet future water demands of Texas. Note that future demands. Many producers of water in this area only worry about their economic future. Hey, it's my water, I'll use it this year, and the heck with the next generation. But Texas Water Development Board tries to make use of this water for future. These plans include all categories of water use: urban water use, agricultural use, industrial use, and recreation. While Texas has sizable quantities of water, the demand for water is expected to continue to exceed the supply for the next 50 years. Please notice, even in 2010, the demand, shown by this red line, exceeded the water supply. If we look at 2010 in the future, the water demand is going to go up, and in this particular scenario, it's going up in a linear manner, while as the water supply is going down, and in this particular figure, it is a linear manner. Why is the demand going up? Demand's going up because we have greater and greater numbers of people. Supply is going down because water is consumed from the aquifers as we pump them. So the problem that we have in 2020 is worse than it was in 2010, but it will be significantly less than it will be in the future. In the mid-1990s, Texas suffered another prolonged drought, which led to widespread economic losses. By this time, the law of the big straw was shown to be totally fallacious, and groundwater withdrawal could not meet the demands imposed upon it. In 1997, the Texas legislature, and they don't want to act unless they just absolutely have to, but by 1997, the Texas legislature realized that they needed to have a regional water planning process. And they wanted it to be bottoms up. They wanted it to be consensus driven by the people who own the land and own the water and are using the water. They want it to be a bottoms up thing. They want the people on the ground to decide what's going on, rather than have a legislative mandate from Austin tell them how to use the water. Again, the people in this area do not like to be told what they're supposed to do. The Texas legislature had this approach, and they divided the state up into 16 regional water planning areas. RWPA is for that. The members of these regional planning groups represent urban, cities, towns, industries, and rural constituencies, as well as other water knowledgeable individuals. These planning groups work towards describing the regional water planning area. Please understand, at this time, they looked at groundwater, they looked at surface water, they looked at precipitation, They looked at who uses water and how much. They also quantified the current projected population water demands over a 50-year planning horizon. Evaluated current water supplies, identified surpluses and needs. Let me tell you, there were very limited amount of surpluses. They evaluated water management strategies and prepared plans to meet the regional needs. They evaluate impacts of water management strategies on water quality, because water quality and quantity are interrelated. They described how the plan is consistent with long-term protection of the state's water, agricultural, and natural resources, recommended regulatory, administrative, and legislative changes, described how sponsors of water management strategies will finance projects, and adopted a plan, including the required level of public participation. The 16 regional water planning areas are shown below. If you look at these water planning areas, these are almost driven by the rivers that I talked about before. You see the Canadian River here, the Red River, the Pecos River, the Rio Grande. And so these are regional water planning areas looking at groundwater and surface water and anticipated needs. So states divided up into 16 regional water planning areas. Since Texas is a large, diverse state, the regional water planning areas identified the water needs and recommended water management strategies for each specific individual region. Lubbock is located in Region O, and the 2016 Regional O report is located at the following website. If you're interested in how they talk about and address water for the future, that's a great place to look at. Now, in addition to the regional water planning areas, Texas also has locally controlled groundwater conservation districts. As your text says, local groundwater conservation districts are the state's preferred method of groundwater management. What happens when you read between the lines? That says that you want local control rather than control from Austin telling you how to do it. The goal of this groundwater conservation district is local control. Individual farmers and producers and city managers controlling this rather than have it imposed from Austin. The groundwater conservation districts are shown in the previous map. Now, if you look at this, the whole state is not covered by a groundwater conservation district in this particular map. Why? You go back to that map that I talked about, the primary aquifers. You'll notice that some of the state does not have large aquifers underneath it, and so they don't need a groundwater conservation district. Now, in this particular groundwater conservation area, we are in this blue area, which is the High Plains Underground Conservation District number 1. Since the southern High Plains depends so much on the Ogallala Aquifer for urban, agricultural, and industrial water use, the first underground water conservation district was formed in the Lubbock region in 1951. If you do the math, you'll notice that this was before the Texas Water Development Plan in 1957. And typically this is known as the High Plains Underground Water Conservation District number 1, and there's their web address. If you own real property in Lubbock and you look at your tax bill, you will see that the High Plains Underground Water Conservation District is a taxing entity. And if you own property, they will receive some money from taxes from the land that you own. Now, members of this group are farmers representing various portions of the district, as well as professional staff of managers and engineers. Again, The idea of this is, hey, it's my water. I own the land. I own the water underneath it. You can't tell me what to do. And so the producers or the farmers make up part of this underground water conservation district, as well as professional staff managers and engineers to talk about how much water can be pumped. The groundwater conservation districts have 3 primary legislative mandated duties, as your text says: permitting non-exempt wells, developing a comprehensive groundwater management plan, and adopting rules necessary to implement the management plan. First one, permitting non-exempt water wells. If you have a small well, 2-inch diameter, that you use for domestic purposes, hey, I own a farm out in Lubbock County. I have a house on that farm. I have a 2-inch well. High Plains Underground Water Conservation District does not regulate that. My son and his in-laws own a small piece of ground north of I live, and they own about 25 acres. There are 4 families live out there. Each of them has a 2-inch well, and they can get enough water for domestic use. And people often ask me, will water ever run out? Well, the question really depends on if you add one extra word to it. Will water ever run out economically? There will always be water under there that you can pump. The question is, will it be economically feasible? 3 out of those 4 people that live in that family compound have domestic wells, and they have no problem with it. The 4th person owns some horses. There's no way that his 2-inch well will supply enough water to provide feed and forage for those horses. It will do well domestically, but it will not do well from growing forage for that. The Underground Water Conservation District developed a comprehensive groundwater management plan. They tell you how much water, how close the wells are going to be, and then they adopt rules necessary to implement that management plan. In 2001, the Texas Water Development Board designated groundwater management areas, GMAS, and the groundwater management area is to define areas considered suitable for managing groundwater resources. And again, the web address is there. The groundwater management area is shown in the following diagram. If you look back at the previous one where we talked about groundwater, or we talked about water available areas, is a slightly different map than this one. The difference between the two is that the previous map, when we talk about total water, is based really on rivers. Where we talk about groundwater management areas, we're talking about groundwater. And so these are much more in line with where the various aquifers are rather than where the rivers are. Lubbock is located in groundwater management area 2. And here's a figure for that. So you can see how big this area is. And you can see again on this with that total map of the groundwater management areas in the whole state. The groundwater management area 2 not only includes the Ogallala Aquifer, but it also contains the High Plains component of the Edwards Trinity Aquifer, which is in the southeast corner of this, and the deeper Santa Rosa Aquifer in the Docken Formation. Now, underneath the Ogallala Aquifer in a large area is the Santa Rosa. Unfortunately, the Santa Rosa is very high in salinity, and so it is not used much at all because of the low quality water and the deeper depth, which takes more energy to pump it out. The explanatory report for the desired future conditions, final, the Ogallala, Edwards, Trinity, High Plains, and Dockham Formation Groundwater Management Area is located at the following website. That is a very complex title, but it talks about the desired future conditions, what we want the water to be in the groundwater in the future. Desired future conditions for groundwater management 2 calls for, quote, an average drawdown between 23 and 27 feet, unquote. This drawdown is calculated from conditions at the end of 2012 through the year 2020 and expressed as a range due to the link between future pumping and future rainfall. So what they want to do is they want to control the desired future conditions. They want in 2070 to have anywhere from 23 to 27 less feet of water in the Ogallala aquifer than they had in 2012. The idea of this is there will still be water available in 2070, and they'll have another management plan to figure out what they want to do for desired future conditions. Going back to that first cartoon I showed you, if you run out of water, you're in much more trouble than if you run out of oil. And so the idea of we want to control future conditions so that we can have water available for future generations. For the High Plains Underground Water Conservation District number 1, the available production rate is 1.5 acre feet per contiguous acre per year. What does that mean? That means if you have 1 acre of property, you're allowed to pump 18 inches of water and cover that acre. Now, this rule really is more manageable for an agricultural producer than it is for some other people. For example, if I own a section of ground, I can use my irrigation water. I can put that 18 inches on half of it, or I can put 36 inches on half that land, or I can put 18 inches on all of it. I can use it the way I want to, as long as I don't exceed the 1.5 acre feet of water per contiguous acre per year. I can use that water however I want it. The farmers and the producers in this area are very good managers, and they can get around this restriction with some problems, but at least they can solve them. The problem really hits the fan if you're a small town. Let's say you're Acuff or you're Abernathy, and let's say your bedroom community is for Lubbock, and so your population grows. They're still only allowed to pump 1.5 acre feet of water per contiguous area per year. If that population grows, they're going to have to buy more land to get more water resources to supply that. It really hits the dairy farms and feed yards especially hard. They have a very small footprint. If you own a dairy, you got 1,000 head of dairy cows on a small area, and to pump enough water to water those cattle on a daily basis, you need a bigger area. If you think about a dairy farm, what do they sell? They sell milk, which is just water with other substances in it. And so they need more water. And so this is a problem for them. Feed yards is the same way. If you talk about the feed yards that they have, 1,000 head, 10,000 head, the demand for water feed yards, it's just hard to get enough water at 1.5 acre feet per contiguous acre per year to supply that water needs. Well, we've already talked about regional water planning areas, groundwater control districts, groundwater management areas. We need to further discuss component of water planning. One facet of this is groundwater available model, or GAM. As discussed earlier, the hydrologic cycle includes aquifer systems that are complex and occult. My wife about fell over laughing when she found out that they are occult. GAMs include aquifer recharge and other properties such as hydraulic conductivity, specific yield, porosity, geology, and pumping. Texas law requires that the groundwater control districts and regional water planning areas use modeled available groundwater to determine desired future conditions. Since the state owns the surface water, that is allocated by prior appropriations. There's a need to evaluate new or amended water rights. Hey, I want to form a lake, or I want to use water for this particular reason. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality uses water available models to predict surface water availability and uses authorization, simulation, and current conditions when granting and denying surface water withdrawals. You can understand weather conditions radically alter the surface water availability. With low rainfall areas such as West Texas, there's limited availability compared to East Texas. If you have a dry year like we had this year, or we had in 2011, the precipitation availability is radically different. Public water systems are required to have contingency plans to conserve water during times of drought or emergency. In Lubbock, you can only irrigate 2 days a week, and you can only irrigate at a particular time, and you can only irrigate a certain amount. Why? We're in a drought, we have limited water resources, and so they limit the amount of water that you can pump. Wholesale public water supplies, irrigation districts, and retail public water suppliers must submit draft contingency plans to the TCEQ every 5 years. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the Texas Water Development Board require water providers and other entities to develop water conservation plans and revise those every 5 years. Humans typically think on a linear scale, but population might change and it might be a logarithmic scale. So they have to do this every 5 years. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Land and Water Strategic Plan was first developed in 2002 and updated in 2015. The plan is arranged into 4 goals. The goals and objectives are intended to practice and encourage and enable science-based stewardship of natural and cultural resources. 2, increase access to and precipitation in the outdoors. 3, educate, inform, and engage Texas citizens in support of conservation and recreation. And 4, employ efficient and sustainable and sound business practices. We talk about management of Texas water quality. Water quality is based on the Federal Clean Water Act of 1972, abbreviate that CWA. The Clean Water Act is administered by the US EPA. The Clean Water Act requires states to establish and implement water quality standards. The act is administered by the US EPA and requires states to establish and implement quality standards. In Texas, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality is charged with implementing the Clean Water Act. Now, as before, we've mentioned that Texans don't like to be told what to do. Texans were really bent out of shape over this Federal Clean Water Act. And they didn't like the Environmental Protection Agency telling them what to do. One provision of this Clean Water Act said that if states want to be more stringent in the federal guidelines, we will welcome that and we'll let the state control that. Texas decided that the EPA clean water standards were less onerous than what could be imposed locally. And so Texas uses the EPA standards rather than have more stringent ones. TCEQ defines water bodies and water quality standards, measures water quality, assess water quality and irrigation in relation to established standards based on use of that particular water body. The 5 water body use categories are as follows. Aquatic life. And we've really not talked about aquatic life much, but you as master naturalists need to be aware of the aquatic life that we have. Fish, turtles, waterfowl, contract, recreation. Can I boat in this water? Can I swim in this water? Public water supply. Can I drink this water? And then fish consumption. What do the fish consume? And then you eat the fish. What sort of pollutant or toxin can you get? One of the big problems that occurs in the Northeast US is mercury contamination in fish. And so there are certain areas of the country that limit how much fish you can eat from a particular river, stream, or lake because of the mercury. And then there are just general rules. Now, the Texas Commission on Water Quality monitors statewide to determine if water bodies are supporting their designated uses. The monitoring is typically conducted quarterly as part of the state's biennial water plan assessment. TCEQ is required to develop and submit reports to the EPA that describe the state's water quality and the extent of water bodies that meet the acceptable water qualities. These reports are referred to as 305B reports and 303D lists. I think you as master naturalists are interested in the gross concept of what's going on and don't really need to be concerned about what is in each individual report. Within the 305B report, water bodies are characterized 1 to 5. Category 1 is attaining water quality standards with no threatened use. And then it decreases to category 5 where water quality standards is not being met and are threatened by 1 or more pollutants. With the implementation of the Clean Water Act, water quality standards for aquatic life, contract, recreation, public water use, fish consumption, and general use are considered. Water quality monitoring and assessments. Data collected often includes biological, chemical, hydrological, physical characteristics of the water body, pollution and pollution management, including point source and non-point source pollution. Texas pollution discharge elimination systems, non-point source pollution, total maximum daily loads, and watershed protection plan. Point source pollution occurs from one specific area, such as a pipeline, drainage ditch, while non-point source pollution occurs from a general area. The following humorous overhead cartoon is a short cartoon of point source pollution. Can I fertilize your lawn, sir? If this cow deposits some fertilizer on the guy's lawn and water runs off from that, that's a point source pollution. Now, hopefully that is a humorous cartoon, but when we talk about point source pollution in the case of lead contamination, the drinking water of Flint, Michigan, that is not a humorous matter. A lot of infants have had severe health problems due to lead pollution in Flint, Michigan. One of the insidious problems with lead pollution is it influences negatively the IQ and the thinking ability of people. Non-point source pollution, shown in the following figure, can be from suburban development, city streets, rural homes, forestry, cropland, or animal feed yards. And here are these components. They're putting it into this water body and contaminating it. Non-point source pollution for arsenic distribution groundwater is shown in the following figure. Here is the Panhandle and High Plains area of Texas with arsenic in the groundwater. A publication written by Bridget Scanlon is one of the best articles on groundwater and groundwater contamination for the Southern High Plains. In addition to arsenic, the Scanlon article also discusses selenium, boron, salinity, chloride, and uranium in groundwater on the Southern High Plains. Now, one component of this, let's say you live in Big Spring, Texas, which is Howard County, and your public water supply pumps from groundwater. The groundwater is high in arsenic naturally from the geology. And it really hit the fan about a decade ago when the EPA decided to make the arsenic concentration limits much more stringent. They divided it by half. And so you can only have half as much arsenic in water now as you could a decade ago. What happens in Howard County is they blend the water, high arsenic water with low arsenic water to meet the demands. There are many state and federal agencies, entities engaged in describing and managing Texas water. The Texas State Agency are the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ I mentioned, Texas Department of Agriculture, Department of State Health, the General Land Office, Parks and Wildlife Department, State Soil and Water Conservation Board, the Water Development Board, the Railroad Commission. Universities are also important. I think your book is very Texas A&M centric when it comes to it. And so I took the liberty of including other water centers from Texas Tech University and Tarleton when I did this particular thing. The federal agencies include the International Boundary and Water Commission. They're really what happens on the Rio Grande and Lake Amistad. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the Natural Resource Conservation System, US EPA that I talked about, US Army Corps of Engineers, United States Geological Service, and the US Bureau of Reclamation. And then throughout the state, there are numerous regional and water commissions and water quality. We talk about emerging policy and issues. Your textbook starts off with a quote. Many of the recommended strategies in the state water plan have pros and cons, which are controversial at times. However, all strategies are needed to meet future water demands, unquote. And this is where I think you as master naturalists need to come in. Anytime there's a controversy, hopefully we can all agree on the facts, but we have differences in opinion on how to answer, how to come up with plans. You as master naturalists, hopefully will use those facts and advocate for nature. In issues of water, reservoir concentrate construction, interbasin transfer, aquifer storage, recovery, water reuse, desalinization, groundwater surface water interaction, financing, infrastructure, Endangered Species Act, water management, providing for environmental flows and nutrient water quality standards are practices or issues that need to be faced in the future. Let me address some of these in more detail. Reservoir construction. Reservoir construction is a water resource issue as confounding Lubbock, Texas. The following map represents the unique reservoir sites designated by the state Texas legislature. So here's the state, and where you see all these little dots are where there are plans for future reservoirs. If you look very carefully at this map, you will see two dots that sort of superimpose on them. And those are Jim Burton Lakes 7 and 8, shown on the above map. Both of these future lakes, again, remember there's only one natural lake in Texas. The lakes are formed behind dams. Both of these sites for future lakes, dams, were part of the 2013 Strategic Water Plan for the city of Lubbock. Note the location of these two lakes with respect to the city of Lubbock are shown in this figure. Here's sort of the canyon lakes going through. Here's the city of Lubbock. Here's Jim Burton Lake number 1. Here's Ransom Canyon. And here is Jim Burton Lake number 8. If you've been around Lubbock for any particular time, you know the problems that we have when we got Lake Allen Henry. In the finite wisdom of our city council, they bought the land for Lake Allen Henry, but said, oh, we don't need to worry about the mineral rights of Lake Allen Henry. So they built the dam, they started flooding it, and then lo and behold, there were some oil wells where Lake Allen Henry was supposed to be. And so they could not flood Lake Allen Henry to its maximum capacity. And so Lubbock messed around for years. And finally, after a period of time, they went back and bought the mineral rights from the oil wells in Lake Allen Henry so that they could then flood the whole lake. It probably cost them more money in the long run to buy the land without the mineral rights and then go back later to get the mineral rights, because the people who owned them had Lubbock over a barrel. They needed to get the lake and they couldn't do it without the mineral rights. And so Lubbock paid more for that. The same thing is going to happen with Lake 7 and 8. Now, subsequently to 2013, Jim Burton Lake 8 was removed from the request from the city of Lubbock. But Jim Burton Lake 7 is still part of the current Lubbock, Texas 2018 Strategic Water Plan. Work is ongoing to implement development of Jim Burton Lake 7. Use for waters, lakes, and 7 and 8, if needed, would come from reuse of city water. And so there are environmental problems with creating a dam and making Lake 7 or 8. I would not be surprised that if in the very long term, as Lubbock continues to grow, that Jim Burton Lake 8 will reemerge on the need for the city. And again, Lubbock will be faced with the environmental challenges of getting a new lake. Another one of these facets is interbasin transfer. Interbasin transfer means transfer from one river basin to another. The Roberts County well field is a major groundwater source that augments the Lake Meredith supply for domestic and industrial uses of Lubbock and the other South Plains area. If you've lived in the Lubbock area for a period of time, you'll remember that not too long ago, Lake Meredith was not only dry, but you had to add water to get it up to zero. That was below where they had the water management land to pump the water. Twice the CREMWA, Canadian River Water Management Association, lowered the intake so that they could get water from Lake Meredith. Now, Roberts County was owned by the late T. Boone Pickens, who owned the water rights to Roberts County. T. Boone Pickens made his money on oil, but he did corner the water market in Roberts County. And what he wanted to do was take that water from his land in Roberts County, ship it to the Metroplex. The problem with that is that it was a very, very grossly expensive project. And they didn't want to build a pipeline to ship it from Roberts County to the Metroplex. So it turns out that what happened was that T. Boone's Pickens sold it to CRMWA, the Canadian River Municipal Water Authority. And so water is pumped from the aquifers underneath Roberts County. It goes through the same water pipelines from Lake Meredith to Lubbock and Tahoka and Levelland. If you ever drive up Interstate 27 from Lubbock to Amarillo, occasionally you will see a cement structure coming out of the ground that's about 4 feet in diameter with a metal cap on it. That's the access line to the water that comes from Lake Meredith and Roberts County in this way. One nice thing about Lake Meredith is it is elevationally above where Lubbock is. And so that water flows through the pipeline by gravity flow. We don't have to pump it. The problem with Lake Allen Henry is that Lubbock is elevationally above Lake Allen Henry. And so to get water from Lake Allen Henry up to Lubbock, they have to pump it uphill. And Lubbock paid for the pipelines to do it. And Lubbock is currently paying the pumping of water from Lake Allen Henry to water. Recently, I've seen a report that said that people in New Mexico are thinking about buying wastewater from the city of Lubbock for secondary recovery of wells in New Mexico. And that again would be an interbasin transfer. If we talk about desalinization, desalinization is removal of salts from brine or seawater to make the water beneficial. Quote, desalinization expected to provide 310,000 acre feet annually, 3.4% of the total water demand by 2060 in the state of Texas. This water supply enhancement is a costly one and has the problem of what to do with extremely salty brine. Please understand, the reason I was ranting at that single-use bottle of water, it is water that is osmotically produced. It takes energy to get that good quality water. The same thing is it takes energy to desalinate water. And so it very energy intensive process. In coastal regions where this salt water is desalinized, there are dead zones which are extremely salty with the return flow. So you take salt water, apply energy, get good quality water out of it, and then you return the high salt brine back to where you found it. And it is very, very high saline zones. Israel and Jordan have a desalinization plant for water for Jordan, and they use water from the Dead Sea. Now, that's not really a problem in that particular area because the Dead Sea is a highly saline lake anyway. It's more saline than the oceans. And what they do is they use the salts from that as a fertilizer. If you look at other areas in Israel that have desalinization, and Haifa is one of the examples. They pump in water, they return the brine back to the Mediterranean Sea, and there are dead zones out in the Mediterranean Sea with very high brine water. Same thing is true in California where they use desalinization. In addition to inorganic salts that diminish water quality, there's a problem of organic endocrine disruptors, personal care products, and medicines that pass through urban wastewater plants and enter the system. One of the big things that people are starting to look at is if you take chemotherapy, you don't use all of those chemicals. And so you excrete them, they go into the water treatment plant. They're not set up to take out those medicines from the water. Let me now talk about virtual water. And this is one concept that was not addressed in your textbook. Virtual water is water that is in commodities that's not in the aqueous form. By that I mean water that goes into corn grown in Iowa and other states that's transferred to Texas to feed the cattle. It takes about 5 pounds of water to grow 1 pound of corn. So we ship corn to Texas for feed yards. We're really shipping water in that corn. Virtual water is water it takes to grow cotton on the southern high plains that's shipped to China and make cloth or clothing. These are additions of water loss that are not considered in the hydrological cycle. And you as master naturalists must be aware of these intangible gains or losses of water from Texas. These are the policies exactly that have your arena of expertise. As master naturalists, you're going to be needed to think about and provide intelligent discussion in these manners. Your understanding of water resources and water resource needs in the future will enable you to aid in pressing discussions of water in the future of Texas. What can you do? One thing you can do is harvest rainwater. As stated earlier, Texas has a significant surface and groundwater resources. Urbanization, however, has altered water flow by increasing the impermeable surfaces. For example, there are some areas in Houston that flood every year that used to flood once every 100 years. Why? There are parking lots, there are buildings, there are streets, there are driveways, there are houses, there are buildings. The water can't go into the soil under those. It hits the impermeable surfaces and runs away as flood water. To use precipitation for beneficial use, rainwater harvesting from structures that capture runoff. Water runoff can be captured from buildings as follows. And this picture is taken from the High Plains Underground Conservation District number 1 main office on Avenue Q. The water runs off the top of the building. They store it in barrels. They also have water harvesting from their parking lot. The water runs off the parking lot, goes into the French drain and the gravel, and then waters the plants alongside. Now, this is not always a panacea. What happens if somebody has an oil leak in the parking lot? What happens if somebody has an antifreeze leak in the parking lot? There is a lot of pollutants on these parking areas that are then transmitted off-site when you have rainwater harvesting. It must be remembered, however, this water is used and does not flow into overland and other areas. At my house, we collect rainwater from the roof to use in our greenhouse. It's collected in rain barrels, and then we store it in 1-gallon jugs to be used to grow the plants. Some of the rain barrels that we have are commercially available. You can buy this one or this one, but then some of them are homemade. Several years ago, there was a group in Lubbock that would teach you how to make homemade rain barrels. My wife went one day and made this particular rain barrel to store the water. As master naturalists, you need to provide voluntary land stewardship. One of the things that we're seeing in this country is less and less public involvement. You as master naturalists need to be that public involvement in natural systems. What you can do individually is take control of your individual system, select drought-tolerant plants, fix leaks that you have in your water, or install water conservation fixtures and appliances. Get involved. You must be an advocate for nature. Nature's not going to advocate for itself. You need to be that source for science-based information, disseminate information for the general public. I have a feeling that in this modern era of the internet, truth is being sort of backbayed. It's not coming to the forefront. People can publish anything on the internet and it's not verified. You need to be the science-based people that make recommendations and be involved in discussion. Review questions. And Kippy told me that everything I say is going to be on the exam. So you need to know this stuff. Review questions. What are the functions of water within the environment? Physical, biological, and chemical. What are the functions of soil with respect to water? Acquire, store, and deliver. Describe the hydrologic cycle, water balance equation, identify water resources in Texas. We talked about the very simplistic cycle: precipitation, evapotranspiration, and condensation. The water goes around and around. The water balance equation: precipitation plus irrigation plus runoff equals runoff plus evaporation, transpiration, deep drainage, and storage, and then ground and surface water. Describe the importance of water conservation, protection of both surface and groundwater. Water is a finite resource. It must be protected for future generations. So all too often, people are using that water resource for their own at the expense of not having it for future generations. Describe the management of Texas water resources, including water rights and ownership. Surface water is managed by the state, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, while underground water is managed by groundwater conservation districts in conjunction with groundwater management area. Surface water is state-owned, groundwater is privately owned. Describe the state water planning and groundwater management process. Texas Water Development Boards develops water supplies, prepares the state to meet all anticipated water needs. Groundwater conservation districts, in conjunction with groundwater management area, determine the desired future conditions of subsurface water. Describe the Texas water availability model, drought contingency plans, and water conservation plans. Water availability models are based on prior appropriations of surface water, aquifer water availability, and historic hydrology. Drought contingency and water conservation plans are determined by the drought strip. Discuss the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Land and Water Strategic Plan. The plan protects the state water resources while using a science-based stewardship to increase access and educate Texas citizens using sound business practices. Describe how water quality is assessed and managed and how the planning process is being used to improve water quality. Water quality is monitored and assessed by TCEQ to minimize pollution. Identify state and federal agencies and water resources institutes that work with the public on issues concerning water. There are federal, state, universities, and other agencies that evaluate water quality and quantity from various aspects. Discuss the emergent water policies and issues. There are many strategies such as reservoir construction, interbasin transfer, aquifer storage and recovery, desalination to enhance Texas water availability and quality. Describe rainwater harvesting and other actions that you can take. Rainwater harvesting is collecting rainwater for positive benefits. Thank you. Other questions?
What? I've got a quick question. This is Christopher Keeble. When I hear about or read about water conservation around here, it's primarily focused on, how we're getting the water to where we're using it, like the different irrigation methods. And then I look at the farms around here, and almost all of, it's all cotton. How much is preserving the soil part of the conversation around here? I'm not a part of the conversation, so I don't know. But it just seems like we've got a lot of dirt that sits there with no cover on it. And isn't soil health part of conserving water?
Typically about 60%. Typically about 60%. We're getting the feedback. Typically, the area is about 65% cotton. Cotton is used because it's really one of those crops that is very well adapted to this particular area. Now, I think your point is well taken in that cotton has very low organic matter production that goes into the soil and maintaining soil productivity. But I think you'll find out that a lot of farmers are implementing methods to not only use cotton, but use other crops in a rotation to increase organic matter. The cotton farmers today are really doing a much better job of managing their water resources than they have historically done. We're using less water now to produce more cotton. And so in that aspect, with less water and more cotton, the farmers are really doing a fairly productive area of water management.
Thank you.
Richard, we have a chat question. You mentioned 3 books earlier.
So again,
3 books. You mentioned mentioned 3 books earlier. What are those again?
oh, the 3 books. Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck is the classic one. The Dirty 30s or the Drought Dust Bowl era. The other one is The Worst Hard Times. And I forgot who the author is, but it really talks about more of this particular area. And then the third one is The Drought of the 1950s, called The Time It Never Rained by Elmer Kelly. And like I said, that book will just tear your heart out and stomp on it. It's so poignant.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question about soil when there has been decades of irrigation. Is salinity buildup a problem in our irrigated farmlands?
Not in this particular area. And it turns out that our water quality from the wells is typically better than the water that we drink in the city of Lubbock. So there's a twofold answer that why the problem is. One of them is we do get the 18 inches average rainfall per year. And so that will tend to move the salts below the roots and so not cause salinity. And the second one is that our irrigation water quality is typically better than our urban water, and so we're not increasing salts. If, however, we try to use seawater, that would totally ruin the soil. If, for example, we tried to use the saline water of the Dockham Formation Santa Rosa Aquifer, that would limit. And so it has to do with typically the water we apply by irrigation is low salts, and we get enough rainfall that we tend to dilute the salts in there. In certain areas, if you look at California, where they get much, much less rainfall, and they use water from the Colorado River, then they are picking up salinity problems.
Thank you.
Someone said they were hoping you mentioned Cadillac Desert. You know about that?
Oh, Cadillac Desert, yeah.
I don't know about that.
I think there was a book called The Cadillac Desert, and I think it really has to do with, and I'm really out on a limb on this, and I think it's the idea of using water at a much more higher rate than what it should be.
Richard, this is Dan Grant. I'm the one who asked that question.
Hey, Dan.
How you doing? How you doing? Yeah, it's Cadillac Deserts by Mark Reisner. It's about the big data project or big water projects all across the West.
Oh, big water projects across the West. Okay.
And it's just fascinating from being.
Anyone else have questions? Rick for putting in so much time on this, great presentation, and remember, this counts as, is it, anybody hear me? I'm muted, I think. Y'all hear me?
Okay, there. Now can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay, this counts as basic training and advanced training. So whichever, except for you trainees, you'll do basic training, and the people who are already master naturalists will do advanced training. So we've gone for basically 2 hours. Are there any other questions? Anybody want to say anything else? Some of the
Thank you very
some of the
much.
comments are great topic and presentation, fantastic presentation. So thank you, Rick. All right, everybody. We'll see you Monday night.